Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Most of us do not know how it's done or if the Russians are behind it, but cyber attacks are certainly a cause of alarm. We'll look tonight at this silent threat. In Baton Rouge, the new legislative leadership is starting to form, and the governor offers his perspective on the state of politics. Meanwhile, media questions are being raised about the effectiveness of the state's Department of Environmental Quality. Our Future Watch segment looks at the state of peddling as the Blue Bike program reaches its second anniversary. And in Louisiana, this seems to be the season of the quarterback at both the college level and in the pros. In the huddle for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Gordon Russell, the Times-Picayune and New Orleans Advocate's managing editor for investigations. Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter. And Stephanie Grace, political columnist for the Times-Picayune New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go over to Gordon first because cyber attack on the city of New Orleans, and it's really
a mess.
Made a mess of things, yeah.
Yeah, it started last week and kind of took everybody by surprise, which I guess, of course, it did. And it's unclear kind of exactly what this is and what they're after, but what we know so far is that they appear to have used phishing, which is when people go into your computers remotely and try to extract things like passwords and so forth by through trick questions or through tricking you into logging into something. And this maybe had been going on for some time, and then what cyber experts have told us is that they gathered enough of this information that they were able to unleash this bigger kind of virus on the whole system. The experts we've talked to told us this is something called WYES, and it's a ransomware that was developed, they believe, in Eastern Europe, possibly Iran, and tied to organized crime groups. And it's a little hard to understand exactly what they're after, but the idea is that you try to extract ransom from the person or organization whose computers you have infiltrated. And I don't fully understand why public entities are the best. If I were doing this, not that I would do this, you would think that you might go after a private company, which would be apt to cough up some money in order to get their computers working again. They have actually successfully, New Orleans is not the first city that's been attacked this way. Baltimore was attacked and was kind of brought to its knees by something like this. And there have been a couple of cities in Florida that did actually pay a ransom to get their the attackers to release them from this kind of spell. So what you're seeing at City Hall is a lot of paper records, a lot of old-fashioned methods. Most departments are open, but they're having to have workarounds for some of the things that they normally do. They have figured out a way to still collect traffic camera tickets and parking tickets, you'll be relieved to know. And traffic and municipal court are closed until the new year.
Until the new year.
How would somebody pay a ransom if they wanted to? It's not like leaving a briefcase in City Park or something.
So these are usually paid in cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin, which I guess, and I'm no expert on cryptocurrency, but I gather there's a way to pay and collect this money without sort of leaving any fingerprints. So it's a preferred method of payment for people who engage in this kind of thing.
The question is, what can you do to prevent this? I know there are safeguards put on all of these networks, but still, the state got attacked earlier, in November?
A number of offices have State Office of Motor Vehicles. We've had a couple of sheriff's offices that have been attacked. I think Baton Rouge Community College got attacked recently. And I think you can hire these cyber consultants who will come up with ways to defend your system, but I think, they're not infallible, obviously, and I think they would tell people to not respond to emails and things that look like they're phishing for your passwords. If something asks you for a password, you should be sure that it's a program that you actually use.
I've read that in some communities that haven't paid the ransom, they went back and, to scrub their system and just started anew. It cost them a whole lot more than the ransom would have cost.
That's right. In Baltimore, I believe the ransom was only $76,000, and instead of paying that, they've cleaned up, as you said, and it cost them maybe $18 million.
Wow. So far,
Except
any
that
idea
paying the ransom just encourages these guys to do it more.
Sure, and I don't see where you have any guarantee that they're going to leave you alone.
Right.
Yeah. So what's it cost in the city of New Orleans thus far just to deal with this?
They have not said, but I imagine it can't be cheap. And of course, the city's dealing with 100 other crises at the moment.
Really.
So
things they were not expecting. So, like you said, City Hall is still open for business, but they're just pushing paper right now.
Yeah.
Any idea when they're going to be able to, but there are 4,000 computers or something that are going to have to be scrubbed?
I would say the city hasn't been especially forthright about this.
Yeah.
They've been clear that this is a big problem, and they seem to be hinting that sort of as we come into the new year, things will be okay, but I'm not sure they really know.
Okay, well, I hope this is the last of it, but the thing is, it could happen again, it seems. It's just really
Seems like it
frightening
will.
deal.
I mean, it's just a question
It just keeps happening
of where
to
they're
different
going to strike
communities and
next.
institutions.
And
yeah.
some other sheriff's offices around the
And so
state.
crime organizations that could be behind this.
That's what experts believe, yes.
Okay. We'll see. All right, Steph, let's go on over to you right now. And the governor talked about what this past year has been for the state. I'm sure it's been a very busy one for him, seeking re-election.
Yes.
And then what he sees for the future. What's his outlook?
Governor John Bel Edwards had his annual year-end press conference. He does it every time this year. He talks about his accomplishments for the year and he takes questions. He was in a pretty good mood, I have to say, because it's not his last, let's say. It wasn't his goodbye. It was looking forward to his second term, and of course that was very hard fought. But a lot of the topics were similar. He said one of the thing he really highlighted from this past year is we had budgetary stability, which has not been the case in previous years. So that meant investment in teacher pay raises, in direct funding to higher education, some money for early childhood education. And when he talked about what he wants to do in the next 4 years, really starting the next year, same things. Mm-hmm. He wants to do more of that. Education, education, education. Early childhood, teacher pay. He wants to bring teachers up to the Southern average, through the MFP inflationary increases and also raises voted on by the legislature. And I said early childhood education, the big push for that, and also keep funding higher education, which took such a hit in previous years.
So how does he foresee these next 4 years in dealing with the legislature, as opposed to what he's just been through in his first term?
One thing that was interesting was when he started getting questions, his mood, it didn't sour, but he got a little snippier because the questions were about that. The questions were about how will you deal with this newly independent, they would say, partisan, the governor would say, confrontational, the governor would say, Republican majority, supermajority in the Senate, almost a supermajority in the House. We got kind of a taste of it at something called the Revenue Estimating Conference meeting recently, and that we talked about it on previous shows. That's the group that is supposed to decide how much money the state can spend based on economists' analysis, and it was a reform measure from a couple decades ago. It was designed to take the politics out of forecasting. Basically, the governor could say we have this much money to spend, so that's what we'll spend. Now it's supposed to be based on expert opinion, and his adversaries are again throwing a wrench into it. Cameron Henry, the same guy who is kind of on his way out as a top leader in the House, he's moving over to the Senate, but will be a more junior senator, was in this meeting, and he held up a vote because he held up approval of the money that is to be recognized for next year, and he can do that because it's required to be a unanimous vote. And that means that when the governor puts together his budget, he can't include some of the money that he actually expects to have. So it really just pushes spending into this very political, confrontational space, which is kind of where it was for the last 4 years. So I guess I would say, we went through this whole election and we're kind of where we were before, but more so.
With the Revenue Estimating Conference, that happened last year. It was the first time. Everybody was kind of surprised.
It was.
Stunned by this.
It was. And it was the same people. It was Cameron Henry who was sitting in for the House Speaker, Taylor Barra. He was doing that again. Of course, we're at the end of their terms, so it will be new characters next time because the Senate President and the House Speaker each get a seat. The Governor, Jay Darden, his Republican Commissioner of Administration, he was very angry about this and, called it political games, and an independent economist. And so there will be two new people in the House Speaker and Senate President role, which we will talk about later in the show, but they're probably going to be pretty conservative. So the question is, are they going to have this confrontational posture towards the governor?
One person rumored to be possible new president of LSU is Jay
Darden,
So,
exactly.
Yeah, so there might be a change there too.
Exactly, and then one person who's rumored to be his replacement is John Alario, the outgoing Senate president.
Interesting. So we'll be talking more
Yes.
about all of that later on. But also Cameron Henry
Yes.
says that his reasoning is it's easier really just to not plan on the money now.
Because it might not materialize, something could happen. But the thing is, it's an estimate. It's designed to be an estimate, and it does throw a wrench into normal government functions to not be able to come up with an honest budget and plan and all of those things.
Okay, we'll see how it all goes. Don, over to you. Thanks, Steph.
Sure.
Future Watch now. We're taking a look at biking in the city. Blue Bikes, 2 years now.
2-year anniversary of the Blue Bikes, and they announced a major expansion. They're going to be expanding in the following neighborhoods. It's a big list: Uptown, Riverbend, Carrollton, Broadmoor, Gerttown, Central City, the West Bank, and the 7th Ward. Primarily in university areas to get students and tourists who come to those areas. They also will be replacing the fleet with electronic assist bikes, so they're easy for everyone to use for commuting because you can go up to 20 miles per hour with a little electronic assist. So they might also be maybe a little more fun, something to play on. But in addition, the city has seen a whole lot of changes in the biking culture in the last almost 20 years now that we're heading into 2020. In the early 2000s, there were only about 8 miles of paved bike paths in the city of New Orleans. Now there are, it depends on which numbers you look at, about 130 miles of paved biking if you count what people call the sharrows, which are the lanes that just have arrows in them, which says a bike can be here, but so can a car too. It's a shared lane between a bike and
A sharrow.
A sharrow. So that's a new term. If you take the sharrows out, it's about 90, a little bit more than 90 miles. There will be major expansion of the bike network coming up in the new year, primarily in Algiers, 11 more miles built in the first half of the year, as well as big expansion on the East Bank. And what I'm told is that if you have high quality, low stress bike lanes, and by low stress, so what does that really mean? And the gentleman I talked to said, well, how old are your kids? So my youngest is 9. Low stress, you would feel comfortable with your 9-year-old. So you don't have cars zooming past, or if you do, you have bollards or curb stops or something that separate the bicyclists from the cars. So if you have low stress bike lanes, more people use them, and studies show that it makes the roadway both safer for the cyclists and the motorists. Both are safer in that kind of environment. I asked about the Endymion, the big newsworthy crash of last year, and was told that from the city's perspective, safety in bicycling is the highest priority, not just adding bike lanes, but making safe bike lanes for people to be able to travel. But as the volume of people riding their bikes has increased, the volume of crashes actually has not increased. So it is becoming a safer and safer way to transport yourself. It takes a lot of education to know, the bike signals have been the same since we were all little tiny kids, but everybody needs a reminder of what they mean. Who has the right of way in a car and a bike, and that knowledge is being put out by the city and by Bike Easy New Orleans.
But doesn't the motorist lose a lane?
The motorist is losing a lane.
Isn't that bad?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
That's right.
Since the early 2000s, since the early 2000s, there's been a 300% increase in the city of New Orleans in people who commute to work by bike. About 20% of our households are households that cannot afford a vehicle, so a bike is a way to get to and from work or to connect with mass transit. I'm told that where there are bike lanes, if bike lanes are placed where they should be put, then they alleviate some of the traffic, the vehicular traffic on those roadways, and everybody wins. There's a lot of getting used to. I've had to get used to it both on Marconi, we talked about earlier, on Jackson Avenue. A couple of my school commute routes to different schools, like, wait a minute, what just happened to my lane? There's just a knowledge that needs to happen. We have a good geography for biking because our land is flat and small, we don't necessarily have great weather for it, but it is a growing trend nationwide, and it makes a healthier city in terms of people being more active and less vehicle traffic on the road. So it's not something that's going away, and you will be seeing some major expansion in the year ahead.
So biking is up in the city of New Orleans. Those studies that you referred to, particularly the ones about the bollards and the
Tulane has been involved in a lot of those
so it's studies of what we're doing here,
what we
not
are
just
doing
in
here.
other cities. Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Well, more blue bikes out there and
Yes.
other bikes too. Oh, also, are cyclists supposed to wear a helmet for riding around the city? Do you know if that's allowed?
Children are, but
Children?
it's
Okay,
an
for adults. Okay.
adults.
All righty. Thanks a lot, Dawn. Errol, quarterback season.
Remember when Mike Foster was governor? He's governor. He refused to
Yes,
wear a
well,
helmet.
right.
Nobody could tell
Well,
him
that was on a motorbike. Yeah,
that was on a
motorbike.
motorcycle.
Motorcycle,
Yeah.
right.
Just look what happened last week in football, of all things. Okay, first of all, on Saturday night with Joe Burrow winning the Heisman, and it was a landslide. But not only did he win it, but people were just moved by the speech that he made. It just became a national story. So it wasn't just another guy winning a Heisman. I mean, we've been told what a classy guy he is, and then to see this. And then Monday night, what happened? I'll tell you, either the people at the NFL are even more geniuses than we think, or they're very, very lucky. Because if you remember last year, on the night that Drew Brees broke the record for passing yardage, it was on Monday Night Football. And Brees even thinks that they figured out way in the summer that this record is going on, and if he holds that pace, it would be on this date. So they had it. All right. But to have it on Monday Night Football, and I'm sure not knowing that Brees would be missing 5 games earlier in the season, but they hit it, that this was the game, okay? And of course, the person whose record that he broke was Peyton Manning, who made the record playing for Indianapolis. And so they have the game against the Indianapolis Colts, and at the same time coming up to the anniversary of the Saints Super Bowl against Indianapolis. It was just a very, very moving moment. And there are a couple of games in my life when and that doesn't happen very often, when I saw the Saints and I said they played perfect. And the Saints played a perfect game that night. The other night was that famous Monday night game when they came back, the one known by Steve Gleason, but they played a perfect game that night. And so, and here again you have just a brilliant quarterback who's also very articulate. And so what community leaders they are and sports leaders. But
Definitely.
It was a feel-good week.
It definitely was. It felt really, really good. Joe Burrow's speech was so heartwarming, and then the response that it caused. I mean, last I heard, the count was over $300,000 that had been donated to the food bank there in Athens, Ohio, which of course he referred to as being such a poverty-stricken area and kids going home and not having enough to eat. So what an impact.
And then the Drew Brees story is such an incredible one, too. Playing in San Diego, he had a serious injury. They thought the season might be over. He has a surgery. He went to Miami. In Miami, looked at him and says, nah, I don't think we will. And, of course, Nick Saban was the coach there. So you rub that against Nick Saban at the time.
Right.
And then he's still never been MVP. He's broken all
Yeah.
these records. He's always...
That's right. Yeah, there's always this
He's
kid
tough.
that comes up,
Yeah.
okay, which is what happened last week. But certainly he's a Hall of Famer.
Well, both Drew and Joe Burrow, 2 really nice young men, as my Italian mother and aunts would say. All right, thanks a lot, E. Gordon, over to you. And Department of Environmental Quality, there's some concern about what is it doing and not doing for Louisiana?
Yeah, this was part of our series that we've been doing with ProPublica, looking at this industrial boom in Louisiana. We're having all these large new petrochemical plants being built up and down the Mississippi River and over in Lake Charles. And, while it's good for the economy, there's been real questions about whether, we have some of the most toxic air in the country in some of these areas, and this is going to exacerbate it, even though they've been able through technology to come up with much better ways to control air pollution in the last 20 years. So we took a look at that and a couple of stories, and today we recently published a story about the Department of Environmental Quality looking at what they're doing and whether they're regarded as an agency that's really holding polluters' feet to the fire. And I would say that the conclusion is no. And it's not that they're incompetent, but they're required under Louisiana law to do a balancing act between what's good for the economy and what's good for the environment. And that's often meant that they have really tried to, they would say work with industry, but they've tried to allow industry to do what industry wants to do within certain bounds. And they've also, absorbed a tremendous amount of staffing cuts in the last 10 years, starting during the Jindal administration when a lot of state government was cut. So that's, they're coping with a tremendous amount of oversight and permitting needs at a time when they're losing a lot of staff. And you can also see this in they're not issuing as many fines, and there's a lot of ways to look at this. But in general, I would say that they're not, in the people, I interviewed a lot of people for this story, and what I found was that the industry people I interviewed were big fans of the Department of Environmental Quality, and the environmental activists I interviewed think that they could do a lot better.
They have suffered big budget cuts,
Yes.
which of course impacts the number of staff they can have. But the Louisiana, environmental agency is not the only one across the country to have experienced it. And it doesn't matter if it's a so-called red state or a blue state. They're both suffering these same losses. What's going on?
Yeah, I think some of it is probably a function of, there was a recent study that came out that looked at some of this, and a lot of the cuts have come since 2008, when, of course, you had a real financial panic, and a lot of states were forced to lay off a lot of workers, and I think a lot of it is attributable to that. Louisiana has had some of the steepest cuts, and I would say that we are a state that really needs a strong environmental protection agency, given that we have, us in Texas, we really have a preponderance of this kind of industry, and we need somebody who's really holding their feet to the fire.
And also, we are really concerned about cancer rates, which we really can't seem to put our finger on, along this petrochemical alley.
Right. And the cancer question is, it's nicknamed Cancer Alley. There's never been proven a real link, although there's never been disproven. The link can't be really disproven, and a lot of that is because cancer is something that typically often takes a lifetime to develop, and there's so many factors that go into it: what you eat, how you exercise, genetic factors. There's all these things, and it's really difficult often to say, well, this person got cancer because this plant is next door. And sometimes with rare cancers, it's easier to make a link. But they are the state is conducting a more detailed study of the Denka plant in St. John Parish, which has been a real focus of these questions.
Any chance that we'll see these budgets getting beefed up again for them?
I wouldn't hold your breath. I don't think the state is on a sort of even financial footing now, I would say, but not in sort of an adding a lot of people mode. There has been a slight increase over John Bel Edwards' tenure as governor, but basically the cuts that were imposed during the Jindal years have more or less stayed in place.
All righty, Gordon, thanks a lot. Let's talk more about Louisiana politics. And the Louisiana legislature, as you said, GOP majority, they're selecting new leadership.
They are. So this will not formally happen until the new year, but it's starting to happen. On the Senate side, John Alario, who I mentioned earlier, who is a tremendous ally of Governor John Bel Edwards, he's term limited, he's out. So the Senate has a secret ballot, so that's something that's somewhat controversial. But it looks like we have reported, Tyler Bridges, our colleague, has reported that a senator named Page Cortez has the votes. He's from Lafayette, he's very conservative. We're going to have to wait and see if he really does. On the House side, things are happening in public, so that's kind of interesting. The House there are two people who are running who have some significant chance of winning. One is named Sherman Mack, who's from Albany. One is Clay Scheck-Snyder, who's from Gonzales. They're not really different politically. When they talk about what they want to do, they're, again, very conservative. They are support tort reform, things like that. But one of them is the choice of some of the leading Republicans in the state. And behind the scenes, there is a move to basically have the Republicans unite and choose a speaker without needing any Democratic votes. And that would be a change from what's happened in the past. John Bel Edwards, if you recall 4 years ago, he was elected governor, and he did what all governors up until that point had done, which is look around and say, who do I want to be my House Speaker? And he chose Walt Leger, a Democrat from New York. New Orleans. Boy, I apologize, Walt. And he
Used to Walt, yeah.
Yes, and I love New York, but that's not where he's from. But he was voted down, if you'll recall, because the Republicans at that point were a majority. They're more of a majority now, and there was really this idea that, you know, we should have our own House Speaker. And they talk about independence and, of course, separation of powers. That's a good idea. But there's also this level of confrontation that has played out, and that is really what did play out in the last 4 years. This time, there's no pretense that John Bel Edwards was going to get his choice. But what he would like would be somebody, or a Republican who is willing to work with him. And that more likely would be someone who would have some Democratic votes and some Republican votes. Jeff Landry and John Kennedy, two Republicans who did not run against John Bel Edwards, but are really kind of his chief adversaries, wrote a letter to the Republicans in the House. They, of course, helped get a lot of them elected, and said, stick together, let's elect alone, then we don't even have to worry about the Democrats. And that may work, it may not work. There was a kind of a vote within the Republican caucus. Mac did win, but he didn't get all of them, all of the votes, so it still could, you know, you'd have to consider him the favorite at this point.
But the votes you got are not enough to
correct.
Get
It's a majority of the Republicans, but not a majority of the House. So there's still some playing out to happen. Of course, when John Bel Edwards looks at this, he says, do we want to be like Washington?
Yeah.
The more that it's Republicans versus Democrats versus reaching to get across the aisle. So that's going to be just the storyline of the next 4 years, I think.
New legislature sworn in January?
January, yes. And then they all go to the national championship game in New Orleans later that day.
And then when will the decision come for leadership, do you think?
Right around then.
Around
It's
that
right.
time when
The votes happen right when they're sworn in.
Okay. All right, it's time now to look ahead.
Yeah.
Well, tomorrow is the New Orleans Bowl in New Orleans against Appalachian State and the University of Alabama, Birmingham. New Orleans is below sea level, but there may be a lot of mountaineers in town because that's what Appalachian State is. Even though they played in the New Orleans Bowl last year and they didn't travel very well, but maybe they went back and told their friends, you know, you should come. And so, but anyway, that's tomorrow.
Okay, Gordon.
Well, some good news. It looks like New Orleans, despite some recent spasms of violence, it looks like we're going to have another year with the lowest murder rate in many years. So despite ongoing struggles in this area, it looks like, barring some unforeseen catastrophe in the rest of the year, that'll be something to celebrate.
Well, it certainly is good news, and we hope that trend continues. Dawn.
A couple weeks ago, we talked about everything holiday in New Orleans. It really culminates Sunday night with caroling in Jackson Square to end the season before the New Year celebrations kick off. The gates to Jackson Square open at 6:30.
I think they're adding a few new carols this year.
Yes.
Okay, we've been talking about all the good football news. Basketball, not so much.
Yeah.
But the Pelicans did win a game finally, and the better news is that it looks like Zion Williamson will be coming back probably in January. They've been pretty secretive about it, but we can't wait to see him.
It can't happen soon enough.
Yes.
All right, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. See you next week.